The median year for a What If Altist episode to start in is 1695, which is no surprise. The 17th and 18th centuries were badass, and if I could live in any era of history, it would be around 1740 in the 12 colonies. However, this does a massive injustice to human history. The vast majority of our existence was spent before the written word came to be invented. Modern humans spent 18 times as long being hunter-gatherers as we have farmers, or nearly 95% of our existence. We used to think that the Stone Age was just a massive period of hunting, foraging, breeding, and starving, with little history. However, genetics and archaeology continually prove this to not be the case. Enormous events and stories are being revealed to us, still remaining elusive behind the gauzy veil of time. Since this is all pre-writing, then that means records are physically non-existent, and thus I can't elaborate on the pedantic details I normally would. However, the Stone Age is incredible, and it's a period I haven't covered a lot, so I'm cramming in 3 short alternate histories into a single video. Number 1. The Megafauna never go extinct. We're in a deep recession in the awesome animal market. Compare almost any ecosystem today to the world 15,000 years ago, and the results would be depressing. The alpha predators today are lions, tigers, and bears, oh my. However, 15,000 years ago, these paled in comparison against even more ferocious beasts. We all know the famous ones like the saber-toothed cats, mammoths, and woolly rhinoceros. There were giant short-faced bears that stood 5 feet tall at the shoulder and 11 feet on their hind legs, that could run 40 miles an hour, outrunning horses over short distances. Australia was inhabited by giant Komodo dragons over 20 feet long. Meanwhile, Latin America was inhabited by giant flightless birds called terror birds that used their heads as battering rams, and giant ground sloths prowled the Americas. So what resulted in the extinction of these great creatures? There's a lot of argument here, but I would say it's a combination of men and the climate. Around 11,000 years ago, the climate had an awful cold snap, dragging the world back into the worst years of the Ice Age. Meanwhile, humans were encroaching upon the ecosystems of these creatures. Like a communist revolution, only the elites of the food chain were wiped out in this. Rabbits and cockroaches weren't going anywhere. For the predators, this was likely a result of their bodies requiring massive amounts of calories to support them, and the humans killing the shared prey better than they could. Meanwhile, for large herbivores, they simply had so few kids that humans killing off a few every few years would result in a precipitous decline in the population over the centuries. It's kind of impossible to make a point of departure for this alternate history. You would either have to prevent the cold snap or the Younger Dryas, which as we will see later, would have enormous side effects upon history, or change human nature in general, neither of which are possible. Let's just use a MacGuffin and say it happens. What would the results be? Firstly, it would equalize the world quite a bit. This is a very interesting map that demonstrates what the biological diversity of a world without the extinction of the megafauna would look like to the world compared today. The first thing you notice is the general sadness of the comparison. Secondly, the Americas would be the biological powerhouses of the world. We find that the areas that the humans were newest to were the ones that were most devastated. Humans evolved in Africa, meaning the animals there were better evolved to us, and thus were not as devastated by us. This is why Africa still has its cheetahs, lions, elephants, etc. However, in the New World, where modern humans were most recent, the horses, camels, mammoth, and mastodon went extinct. Having animals like the horse and the camel would kickstart the Native American civilizations. The horse allows better communication, which allows bigger empires, more spreading of ideas and trade. Just think of how the Silk Road and the Roman Empire improved technology in our world, and imagine how impossible both would be without large draft mammals. This would likely put the civilizations of the New World on technological par with the Old. Meanwhile, dealing with animals is what gave the Europeans such deadly diseases against Native Americans. The Native Americans would have developed similar immunities to these diseases from dealing with similar animals. These forces would have certainly prevented the European colonization of the New World. I don't think Australia would have developed advanced civilizations with the megafauna still around. There's no records of marsupials ever being domesticated, and even if they were, there were no major crops to build an agricultural civilization with. There is the possibility that military technology would be less advanced. The cultures that had easy access to elephants have historically been militarily weaker. I once read in one history book that rather cruelly said that you could always count on India or Southeast Asia being 1,000 years behind the rest of the world in military technology. You could make the case that elephants slowed down military development because they smashed up infantry formations and were simply so powerful. Indian medieval and ancient tactics basically involved the infantry being a seething mob, while the elephants would win the battle. Fun fact, in the original version of chess, the bishops were elephants. On the other hand, there are many lurking variables. The caste system really weakened military structures, and as a general trend, the closer your society gets to the equator, the worse you are at fighting. So I could be looking at a false correlation. Also, before the Roman Empire, the Carthaginians and Seleucids both used elephants and had pretty good militaries, but their supply was also limited. Also, there is a chance there would be more political freedom. In general, the better armed a population is, the freer it is. England, Scotland, Switzerland, and America all had republics because their nations had traditions of peasant troops, whether it be the longbowmen, schiltrons, pikemen, or minutemen, that could beat the nobles and thus conferred greater political power onto the people. If you have large monster animals wandering the world, it's impossible to not have a well-armed peasantry. This would likely result in more political freedom around the world. Number 2. No Younger Dryas. 13,000 years ago, the world was doing pretty well. The climate was warming at twice the speed of current global warming. But since Boston, Moscow, and London were under glaciers, that wasn't exactly a bad thing. Well, actually, it displaced advanced Ice Age societies like the Cro-Magnon that had learned to depend on the icy climate, and the quality of life in Europe actually diminished. But back on point. This trend has been going on for thousands of years, but around 13,000 years ago it backfired, with the climate turning to the worst years of the Ice Age, but likely in the space of 50 years. Just imagine if today Oslo was under ice and Florida had the climate of New York in just 50 years. Modern civilization might collapse and we might return to the 18th century. In this case, we find evidence of cannibalism and mass starvation, with results as mentioned before, such as the extinction of much of the megafauna. There are two possible starters. Firstly, the melting ice water started flowing out of the St. Lawrence rather than the Mississippi, which disrupted the Gulf Stream that brings warm water from the Gulf of Mexico to Western Europe. If this sounds familiar, it's because it's the start of the awful 2004 Roland Emmerich movie, The Day After Tomorrow. I personally prefer the theory that a comet hit the glacier over modern-day Canada, which would explain the rapid temperature collapse. A major effect would be that either the megafauna would not go extinct or it would take much longer to do so. This was covered before in the previous section, but the Younger Dryas either caused the extinction of the megafauna or greatly expedited it. Also, like the megafauna, the Younger Dryas nuked the previous advanced Ice Age societies that were already declining, such as the Clovis in North America or the Cro-Magnon in Europe. In both cases, these artistically and culturally developed societies were replaced by much less advanced ones like the Folsom in North America. A second effect would be much more major. Before the Younger Dryas, the most densely populated area on Earth was the Fertile Crescent, or roughly modern-day Iraq and Syria. Native populations were reliant on nut trees that allowed them to live semi-permanently. The Younger Dryas made the climate suddenly drier and destroyed much of the game and vegetables they relied off. Thus, they started to rely off seeds from plants such as wheat and barley that could survive in cool storage for years. This was the start of agriculture. When the Younger Dryas was over, it was the most lasting effect. I would like to make the claim that without the Younger Dryas, we never would have seen agriculture. We like to think the path we are on is the best and we were destined to go on it. However, agriculture is likely a fluke. Relying off a single crop is really counterintuitive from a hunter-gatherer perspective. Also, the agricultural revolution was sort of a bad idea. Hunter-gatherers were better off than farmers by almost every metric. They're taller, healthier, and better fed. We find that the average person in the Ice Age is around the same height as the present, and much taller than anyone before the Industrial Revolution. Hunter-gatherers have to work less than 40 hours a week, because anything more would degrade their environment and make the next generation starve. Hunter-gatherers were actually more artistically advanced than early farming peoples because they had more time to experiment with art. Agriculture, through the sheer amount of people it could support, was able to raise the total level of human civilization, but at the same time worsened the lot of the individual. This is likely the origin of the Garden of Eden trope we see in many cultures. Mankind was happy in the forest until he and she took the fruit of wisdom and couldn't turn back. It's fitting that Eve was the one who first bit the apple, and the first person to discover agriculture was likely a woman, since they tended to fill the gatherer role that worked with plants. Thus, it makes sense that agriculture would only develop in a world that created very particular circumstances that supported its creation. The last 11,000 years have been relatively ecologically stable, and so those circumstances wouldn't exist ever again. Remember how short the last 11,000 years have been compared to the 180,000 years modern man has existed and the millions of years primitive man spent as hunter-gatherers before then. Also, keep in mind that our entire civilization, with its cities, technology, countries, and world system, only exists due to agriculture, which can feed this massive population that's necessary for all these things. And so, without agriculture, none of this would come to be, and we would still be primitive hunter-gatherers. Number 3. No Toba eruption. Humanity is one of the least genetically diverse mammal species around. This actually makes racism pretty ironic, since we're all so similar by almost any scientific metric. The other edge of the spectrum is a creation of ours, the dog, and I don't think that needs much explanation. For humans, there's actually a really interesting historical reason for this lack of genetic diversity. 70,000 years ago, the supervolcano in Indonesia, Toba, erupted, thus emitting massive amounts of ash into the atmosphere that sparked a nasty ice age. By supervolcano, that's what I mean, with more than 2,000 times the power of Mount St. Helens. The world, meanwhile, is an interglacial period like we are now, with a climate similar to the present. This caused a collapse of human numbers, with human numbers plummeting to 6,000. For perspective on how small that is, there are more people in some cruise ships. Humans nearly went extinct in this era. Ironically, the Neanderthals, adapted to the cold climate, actually did pretty well. We were inches from a world ruled entirely by the Neanderthals. So what would a world without this event look like? Firstly, we would be much more diverse. Tolkien's dwarves, giants, and elves don't seem that far off. Orcs are a bit harder to get, though. In our world, we have the Maasai who average over 6 feet for men, and the Pygmies who average 4'11". It's not hard to imagine. We would see bulkier and stockier peoples near the poles, and slimmer and lighter built people around the equator. Genetics would be a fairly large factor in history, with the bulkier and larger peoples probably conquering the lighter and shorter ones. Toba greatly slowed down the geographic progress of Homo sapiens. We had certainly reached the Middle East and possibly Indonesia itself before Toba forced mankind back into its cradle in Africa. Without Toba, the spread of humanity would have been faster, with the Americas and Australia being settled much earlier, producing completely different kinds of people. There's a possibility the Megafauna would have still gone extinct earlier, due to earlier human contact, which could have many effects. The Younger Dryas would still likely happen at the same time, so the timing for the start of civilization would have likely been the same, however. So I hope that video helped shed light on some of the great events that happened to our ancestors but have since gone untold. If you want more prehistoric videos, please comment that. And as always, thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed that video, please comment, subscribe, tell a friend, support me on Patreon, and have a good day. Thank you very much.